I got my first job at 15, but I knew by the age of 12 that I wanted to be a journalist, and I have no idea how I knew that. My father ran a factory. I had a twin brother who followed in his footsteps. My mother had been an English teacher. A lot of reading went on in my home. I think it was probably my mother's influence. But by 12, my life's path was set. I was the editor of the junior high paper, of the high school paper, and then the age of 15, the sports editor of the Pekin Daily Times, circulation 15,000, in this small town and downstate near Peoria. The publisher of the daily paper had just hired a young recent college graduate to be editor of the paper. We're talking right in the middle of World War II. And I think he was reluctant to hire a woman to be sports editor, so he hired a child instead. And it was middle of 1944, and I began putting out a daily or 6 times a week sports page.
It's still a great field, though, for young people, is it not?
Greatest in the world. That's why I'm in it. I mean, it's got everything. It's got fun, it's got risk, it's got interesting personalities. I mean, the people I've met in my life, I couldn't have, imagined this when I was living in Pekin, Illinois. But somehow I had a sense, because I realized once you're in journalism, newspapers, magazines, television, digital, whatever, it gives you access, the kind of access that other people can't imagine. I remember, among other things, this is during the war, and Pekin boys were being killed all the time. And whenever that happened, the paper would call up the families and ask about this dead soldier, Marine, sailor. They finally let me do it, even though I was maybe 16 by that time, to call up, and I was scared to death. I mean, first of all, good God, what is the family going to react to this? Very courteous, careful, told you who you were and would they please talk to you about their son. They never stopped. That's all they wanted to talk to. And you realized that as a journalist, you tapped into this tremendous psychic need to talk about their grief and their son, and this sense of kind of thrill, of maybe even power, of insight into human beings was just, I mean, at 16, I couldn't believe it. And I realized that I was going to get this one way or another the rest of my life, as long as I stayed in this field. It was amazing.
Well, why don't we talk about the career and the assignment that you got to work in the Atlanta Bureau?
Yes, very briefly, I went to the Navy for 2 years, then I went to Northwestern University for 5 years and began work at the Sun-Times in Chicago, a daily tabloid newspaper, which I have to say I loved. While I was in graduate school, a life recruiter came by and interviewed several of us. And while I was in the working for the Sun-Times, I got a phone call from Life saying that they had a job. I was very reluctant to leave the Sun-Times city room. Loved the idea of being a Chicago newspaper man, but at that stage, nobody said no to Life. So I went to New York, worked there for a couple of years, and then was assigned to the Atlanta Bureau. Life had announced that it was putting out I think a 7-part series on segregation. This was 1956, 2 years after the famous Brown versus Board of Education, which ordered the public schools to integrate. And no Southern schools integrated without specific court order, and that took about 2 years to work through. And in the summer of 1956, several court orders came down. There were 2 schools in Kentucky that integrated with some difficulty. The governor had to call out the National Guard at one point. A couple of schools in North Carolina, and one in particular in Tennessee, Clinton, Tennessee, and there was where I first ran into the violence that ultimately accompanied almost every step forward in race relations in the South.
What do you think Life magazine and the journalism of that time, and certainly you were a part of this, how did that affect the perception of race in this country? Because it was really, that struggle was coming of age at that time, and Life had really dedicated a lot of resources to it.
Life did, and I think Life, and I'm proud to be able to say this, that I think Life was a key factor in the acceptance of the idea of racial equality in this country. Television news at that point was maybe 15 minutes, and most publications, Lifetime, a couple of other magazines, New York Times, had bureaus in the South. Most other publications, television and all the rest, if there was a problem down there, they would parachute. That was the term we used. They would parachute reporters, photographers in. When it was over, they'd leave. We lived down there. We got to know the South, and Life's coverage. Life did 2 things. One, it took a very courageous stand, a pro-integration stand on its editorial page. On the news pages, we tried to be as straightforward as we could be, although Life became an extremely disliked, hated publication down there, and there were 2 dangerous things you could admit to in the South. One is, I'm from the FBI, but if you did that, you had a gun on your hip. Oh, you could say, I'm from Life magazine, and there you had a pencil on your hip, and it didn't help very much. And Life showed what it was like. I mean, that big magazine, those big pictures, and our photographers were just courageous as they could be.
Is there a couple of incidents that stand out?
One was Clinton, Tennessee, where I first encountered violence. Now this is in the mountains of Tennessee, eastern Tennessee. Anyway, they got a court order to integrate, I think it was 9 blacks, and the Saturday before school started in the fall, there was a huge crowd gathered downtown, and the sheriff had deputized a number of people and had gone out and tried to disperse the crowd. Photographer and I were in between the sheriffs and the crowd, which was kind of a stupid place to be, I have to say. Suddenly, somebody from the sheriff's side fired a tear gas canister into the crowd. Major mistake. The crowd fell back, dispersed, and then came running toward the deputies who were in this kind of thin line. Photographer and I were flat on our bellies on the courthouse lawn in between these 2. And I thought, the possibility of being killed in the next few minutes seems reasonably high. And then suddenly, we heard a siren, and then another, and then another. And we looked up on the hill, and a light came, another light came. 50 state police cars had been alerted. The state police had been alerted to the possibility of violence. 50 state police cars came roaring into town. Great big beefy troopers got out and calmed everything down. They had to bring in the National Guard. They blew up the school 3 days later, and so all the students had to move to schools in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, nearby. But it was the first glimpse I had of the kind of feelings, I mean the emotions that existed on both sides. The courage of these black kids to go into the school, the unreliability of police often, particularly if they were local, the necessity of bringing in military, which we saw again and again in the South, and the guts of the journalist. There were a lot of them down there, and I was very proud of my profession. The second was probably the last lynching in the South. It was in Poplarville, Mississippi, one of the scariest places I've ever been in my life. I don't want to go back to Poplarville. A young black man and a companion had been drinking and were walking on the highway, and they came on a stalled car with a white woman inside. Something had happened. The car had pulled over. The man had walked into a nearby town to try to get some help for the car. What happened next is very uncertain. I think it's likely that this young black acted inappropriately, let's put it that way. He never got inside the car, and she never got out. But it scared her a lot. And when her husband finally came back, she told him what had happened. He went to the police. The police found this Mac Charles Parker was his name, put him in a cell, and I think they were going to charge him with rape or attempted rape. That night, a deputy sheriff opened the jail, and a crowd and a mob came in, dragged him out of the cell, down the steps, out to the Pearl River, where they were going to castrate him with those big shears they use on cattle. Car came along, didn't have time to do that, so they shot him and threw him into the Pearl River, where his body was found several days later. We heard about this overnight. A photographer and I flew charter into New Orleans, drove into Poplarville, and by 10 o'clock that morning, we had gone to the sheriff's. You go into a southern town like that, and you want to make sure somebody knows you're there. And at that point, we could tell New York, but they couldn't do anything about it. I said, I think we should go to the authorities and say we're here, who we are. We went to the sheriff's office, the deputy sheriff there, and we said, Life magazine. He was incredibly genial for the South. And I said, is there any possibility we can see the jail? He said, sure, I don't know why not. So he took us over there, opened the jail. The blood was still on the steps where they dragged this guy down with his head bouncing off every step. A pair of boots was sitting in the cell, and the photographer and I saw it at the same time. And so I got the deputy off to one side, engaged in bogus conversation, while the photographer, without flash of course, took this picture of this empty cell and two boots sitting there on the floor. We got it into New York. It ran full page in Life the next week. The genial deputy who let us in that morning was the same deputy who let the mob in the night before. FBI flooded in. Nobody ever went to jail for the murder.
So next you move on to California. There were several big stories.
There were several big stories, and one of them was the defeat of Richard Nixon when he ran for governor of California, defeated by Pat Brown. I remember, because Life was covering this, as bureau chief, I felt I should spend time with both. So I traveled with Pat Brown in his plane, and he was reading something. I said, "Governor, what are you reading?" He said, "Appeals from death row." And good Lord, he said, "You remember the Carroll Chessman case? It was a he was executed, and apparently there was some question about his guilt afterwards, and Pat Brown, I think, was so guilt-stricken by that he personally read these appeals from death row. I was very impressed by that. Then I traveled with Nixon in a jet, bigger plane, and I kept saying to his aides, I said, "No, I've got to speak to the vice president." I'm trying to think, did we call him senator or vice president? I think vice president. Anyway, they kept putting me off, and finally we made 2 or 3 stops, and we're finally up in Northern California. And Nixon came up to me and said, "I understand you want to talk to me. I've been on this plane for 4 hours trying to talk to you." And we had a brief conversation. We'd already done a story on him. I just wanted to explain what we were doing. I never spent a lot of time with Nixon, but he was always, it always seemed uncomfortable to me. Maybe it was just a journalist that made him that way. But he lost the election, and he had a press conference in the Beverly Hills Hotel, Beverly Hilton Hotel, I guess, where he uttered the famous words to this huge bunch of reporters and photographers that you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. And people were stunned, the reporters. And so finally he finished, and he turned to his press secretary, Herb something or other, and they walked out. And I had a young reporter working for him, a guy named Joe Bride. He looked about 12, and I think he was in his middle 20s. I said, "Joe, follow him." So little Joe followed him, and Nixon and his press secretary got out, were walking out of the hotel, and Nixon, according to Joe Bride, taking notes, standing right behind, Nixon said, "Herb, I know you disagreed with that, but I gave them to him right in the ass, and that's where they deserved it." Those classic words appeared in Life magazine the next week.
Did you want to talk about because you were flying from Los Angeles to Dallas during the
Yes.
Kennedy assassination?
Well, I was sitting in my office. We had a colleague named Tommy Thompson, who was a Texas, from Texas, had been a reporter in Texas before he went to work for Life. Because he had worked on the Daily, he couldn't stand being away from the news, so he would walk to the AP ticker 2 or 3 times. It seemed 2 or 3 times an hour, but probably a day, to find out what was happening in the world. And suddenly there was a shout, "Dick, Kennedy's been shot in Dallas." So I ran out there, nothing but bulletins and kind of gibberish coming through, but it was clear that something had happened to the president. So I immediately said, we're going. And it was wonderful, the whole bureau. Somebody was calling up for plane reservations, somebody else was making hotel reservations, somebody else was getting reporters with their cars to drive us to the airport. So I grabbed 2 photographers and Tommy. 2 photographers, thank God, had their equipment with them. And we took off for the airport, and within an hour we were on a plane for Dallas. And that's where the plane was full of journalists carrying, TV people carrying those big cameras and all the rest. The pilot kept us apprised of what was happening, and just before we got to LA airport, we heard on the radio that Kennedy had died. And I remember Tommy, who was kind of emotional, uttered this long moan. I've never heard it. And on the plane, the pilot told us that there had been an arrest. Somebody named Lee Harvey Oswald from Irving, Texas, had been arrested. Tommy turned to me, he said, I know Irving, Texas. He said, and I know the cops in Irving, Texas. Typical newsman's response. He said, I think I should go after that part of the story. And I said, with my blessing, Tommy, and within 24 hours he had an exclusive. He was the only reporter, and photographer Alan Grant talked the way into the house where the Oswald, the wife and the 2 young daughters were staying, and got this incredible interview with. Meanwhile, I was setting up a bureau because other reporters were coming in, and about 6 p.m. We'd heard I guess it was about 6 p.m. Our Stringer, which part-time correspondent, called. It was a woman named Patsy Swank who had been all afternoon down in the police headquarters, had gone home to feed her children, and gotten a phone call from another reporter friend of hers from PD, Dallas PD, Police Department. And this guy said, Patsy, I know you work for Life. I think you ought to know about this. Said there's a big, strong rumor coming around the police department that a Dallas businessman was out there in Dealey Plaza where the president was shot with a movie camera. And what I hear is he photographed the assassination. I said, good God, Patsy. I said, do you know his name? She said, it was pronounced to me, but I don't know how you spell it. And he said, it's Abraham, and the last name is Zapruder. Perfect, perfect. I picked up the Dallas phone book. I'd never been in Dallas before. I ran my finger down the Z's, and there it was, exactly the way she had pronounced it. Zapruder, Abraham, telephone number. I started calling, and called about every 15 minutes but in the next 5 hours. And about 11 o'clock, when I called again, this weary voice answered, and I identified myself. I said, is this Abraham Zapruder? Yes. I said, it is my understanding, sir, that you photographed the assassination with the movie camera. Yes. I said, did you get the entire event? Yes. Can I come out now and see that film? No. And then he explained what he'd been through that day. I mean, he'd seen a man murdered. We all heard about it, but he had witnessed it and caught it on his camera. So I didn't argue. Some instinct at that point said, lay off. He said, come to my office. He was a garment manufacturer, and the factory was about a block from Dealey Plaza. Come to my office at 9. I walked in his office at the garment factory at 8. He looked up slightly annoyed, but I think the fact that I hadn't gone out to his house, because other reporters had bothered him during the night, and in fact apparently had gone out to his partner's home to try to get him to convince Zapruder to do something about this. He said, come on in, and he took me into a small whitewashed room where he was about to show the film for the first time to 2 Secret Service agents. And he said, you can see it with these gentlemen. And we knew what had happened. We didn't have the foggiest idea what it looked like. And it is old, creaky, no sound. I mean, the camera made its own creaking sound. He beamed it up against the wall. Suddenly, you see the motorcade. He was in Dealey Plaza, up on a kind of a wall, and you see the motorcade come around the corner, turn right, then turn left, and then it disappears behind a huge highway sign. When it comes out, the president has both fists shoved up against his throat. What we realized later is the first shot missed as it was just beginning to turn. The second shot hit him in the back, high back, exited through his throat, nicked his tie, and then hit Texas Governor Connally, whose mouth was beginning to open in this howl of pain. And then over the next 5 seconds, Connally falls off the seat, the jump seat, and Nellie, his wife, cradles him. The president is like this, and then suddenly, frame 313, the infamous frame 313. The whole top of the president's head flies up into the air in this spray of brain matter and blood, going that way, which means the shot was coming from behind. And when people argue with me about who did the shooting, I said, watch frame 313. If the shot had come from anywhere else, that blood and brain matter would have gone somewhere else. Anyway, he slumps, blood pouring onto Jackie's pink suit. She looks at him for a second or two and then whirls around and begins climbing out the limousine across the trunk. Secret Service agent jumped off the Secret Service car behind, jumps on the limousine, pushes Jackie back into the seat, falls on top of her, and at that point, a Secret Service agent driving the car realizes what has happened and accelerates and disappears in this underpass. This is 26 seconds. I thought, good God Almighty. When the head went flying, all three of us, the 2 Secret Service guys and I, all responded as if literally we had been gut punched. Simultaneously, we just went, ugh. There's no other way you could respond to. I've seen that film 100 times since then, and I don't go ugh anymore, but there's this my heart races and pounds when I know 313 is coming up. I've seen the film, and at that point I thought there's no goddamn way I'm going to leave this office without that film. And I knew, and at that point other journalists had begun to gather out in the hall. So I excused myself. He showed it to us 2 or 3 times. I got out. I said, is there someplace I can wait while you show the film to other journalists? And he said, we'll go in my office, which I did, where I introduced myself around and particularly befriended his, what we called secretary then, his assistant, who was from downstate Illinois. Aha. And we began talking. Everybody wanted to talk about anything but what had happened the day before. So I asked her about Illinois, and she said she came from close to a little town called Taylorville. I said, Taylorville? I said, they won the state basketball championship when I was sports editor at the Pekin Daily Times. Big grin on her face when a basketball fan. Well, we became friends, which became very important as it turned out afterwards. He showed the film for about an hour, and then he called me back out to the hall, and he said, I know you all want to talk to me, but Mr. Stolley here from Life was the first reporter to contact me, so I feel obligated to talk to him first, you know. The other journalists went nuts at that point, began screaming and shouting, don't sign anything, you've got to promise, blah, 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 and all the rest. I just again disappeared into his office, and we sat down and we began talking, kind of negotiating. I had to find out if he knew he had an incredible piece of film, which he did. And I said, that's a very interesting piece of film, Mr. Zapruder. I said, when Life encounters an interesting piece of film like that, we will sometimes pay more than space rates. I said, we might pay as much as $5,000 for that. And he smiled. So I knew that he knew, and he knew that I knew, so we could then get serious. And about 20 minutes later, I'd offered $50,000, and I said, honestly, I'd called lawyers and big shots at Time Inc. the night before, and I'd gotten, and I said to him, I said, I was authorized to offer you up to $50,000 for print rights only. We weren't, unfortunately, we weren't thinking in platforms back then. And I said, before I go any higher, I have to call New York. And he was a very grief-stricken man. It was kind of sad to watch him. And he looked at me for a minute and he said, let's do it. So I said, you got a typewriter? And he did. I typed out. I'd been instructed by the lawyer what to do, so I wrote a 8-line contract between the two of us. And he gave me the original. We both signed the contract. People, while I was negotiating it, the other reporters were misbehaving badly out there, banging on the door and shouting. Anyway, I said, I don't want to go out that way. I said, you got a back door to this place. He said, he took me out to it. I took the film back to the hotel where we had set up headquarters. A courier was waiting, flew it to Chicago because it was such a late closing. We often set up a editorial office at the Donnelly printer in Chicago, and it was done. Life and Abraham Zapruder have been intertwined ever since. This is devoted to the Kennedy assassination. That's the magazine that Life produced the week after Kennedy died. This down here is the original contract I signed with Abraham Zapruder for the film. That was on Saturday, the day after the assassination. On Monday, I went back to Zapruder. We wanted to buy all rights. We bought only print rights, and which I negotiated for an additional 100,000. So we paid him 150,000. It was a 9-line contract. Then it was 3 pages when I went back to get all the T's dotted and or I's dotted and T's crossed, and I signed both of them. There's a picture of me with the Kennedy assassination issue. That is Abraham Zapruder testifying at the Warren Commission, where he wept when he told about taking that film. That's what the film looked like, the Zapruder film. There are scenes, black and white frames from it, and down here is the magazine that we put out after the assassination, when Governor Conley disputed the finding of the Warren Commission, saying he felt that he had been hit by a separate bullet from that which struck Conley in the back, or struck Kennedy rather, in the back. So there's a lot of history in this window.
This defines your career. How do you feel about that?
I feel fine about that, and I mean it was probably the biggest story of anyone's career who was alive at the time, and I think I was lucky to find Mr. Zapruder before anybody else did. I did 2 or 3 right things then, and I think Life handled the film with great tact and respect and legality. And fascinatingly, the Zapruder film, for people like me, I believe it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone, and the Zapruder film, in my view, proves me right. Conspiracy theorists can use the same piece of film and quirks and things like that to prove that it was somebody on the grassy knoll or somebody over in this building or from a manhole popped up and shot him. The ambiguity of the Zapruder film is the most fascinating thing about it, and it makes me particularly happy that I introduce this ambiguity into the world. So, world, figure it out.
Are there some journalism lessons to take out of this that you exercised, because you really worked pretty diplomatically throughout this entire?
Well, I think it is that very often in journalism, particularly if you had some of the assignments I've had, you really have to be a bastard. I mean, you have to push people around and be mean, and we discovered that in the South. And but there are times when you've got to assess the situation and the psychological pain and the damage that has been done to people, and understand that a very quiet, tactful, respectful, almost sweet approach seems to be best, and you do that, I think, on instinct, hoping you're right, and when you turn out to be right, then you think, well, you know, it was 20 years of journalistic experience that taught me kind of when to be the nice guy and when to be the bad guy. And I've always been very proud and pleased that my instincts on that particular day in Dallas in November paid off. I did when I was in California, and then in the Washington bureau chief, traveling with Lyndon Johnson. I did a lot of overseas travel at that point, but I'd never been stationed over there until after 4 years as Washington bureau chief for life, covering mostly President Johnson. I was assigned to be the senior editor for life in Paris, which meant that I was in charge of bureaus in Paris, London, Rome, Beirut, Moscow, and Bonn. God, I know.
That's a lot.
No, nobody has bureaus like that anymore, unfortunately. So, anyway, it was fascinating because, as I said, I'd not lived overseas, and I'd not done a lot of reporting in foreign countries. So, I tried to learn French badly, and got to Paris just as the student rebellion had taken over Europe. It had started in America over the Vietnam War, and then hopped the Atlantic. England not so much, but in Germany, in West Germany, and in Paris particularly. I mean, it ultimately resulted in Charles de Gaulle resigning and leaving political life, which a lot of French people thought would never happen. And there was rioting in Paris every night for about a week. The students over in the West Bank of the Sorbonne, University of Paris, would come out in the streets, and the Paris police had brought in kind of what amounted to, in this country, to state troopers. They were federal cops, in effect. They wore all black, and they were mean. They didn't like Paris anyway, and they sure as hell didn't like French students. So they were cracking skulls wherever they could. It was an amazing experience. I mean, I'd been tear gassed before in the South, but every night you'd go over there, and they would throw tear gas at the students. One of our photographers got trapped by these CRS, that was what the police were called, and cracked on the skull. I mean, he had 44 stitches in his head. We had to take him to the hospital. I mean, it was a wonder he even survived that. It was a very mean time, and but it did a kind of an amazing cleansing, I think, of French society. Now, this was all in 1960, the spring of 1968, which God knows is a year to remember. And we had this violence, and in Europe in the spring, and then before the end of the year, both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated in America. I stayed out of the country for an entire year. Usually when you're a foreign bureau chief, you come back every few months. And I have to say, I was so disheartened by those two assassinations that I had absolutely no desire to come back to America. So I got there in late December 1967, and I finally, I think, came back to America in the spring of '69. But for that awful year of 1968, I saw America from afar, and I was not happy. I was a bureau chief that wanted to do stories, but it was the Middle East, which was in great ferment then as it is now. I went over there with another reporter and two photographers to the Israeli and the Arab War had already occurred, and the Israelis had moved across the Sinai Desert, and they had taken up positions on what would have been the eastern side of the Suez Canal. They did not go into Egypt. They decided that would be a mistake. But the Egyptians then had troops on the west side, and it was a very strange situation. In many ways, it was like World War I, with the opposing sides dug in and a no man's land in between. In France, that was soil. Here, it was the Suez Canal, which of course had stopped, and all ships in the world had to go down around the Cape of Good Horn. And every morning, before dawn, each side would send out snipers to hide in trees and ruin buildings and all that. And all they did was look across a couple hundred yards of the canal and try to find people to kill. So you moved with extreme caution there. And you'd hear snipers shooting every now and then. I've been there 2 or 3 days with these other journalists, and we heard a shot, and then a phone call, and it turned out there were these kind of bunkers along that side of the canal. A machine gunner had reached out to apparently pull back on the machine gun, and this much of his arm was exposed through a hole not much bigger than this. An Egyptian sniper on the other side saw that movement, shot, and ripped this man's arm almost off. The bullet hit him, and we had a doctor in our bunker, and so they brought him over, and I'll never forget it. They brought him in, and he was, I mean, it's a horrible wound. He was screaming, this Israeli soldier. And they put him down, and he's still screaming. The doctor started to lean over, and the officer who brought this kid over said, "Wait." And he leaned down, and he took his hand, and he went, bam, 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 across the soldier's face. This horribly wounded soldier. I thought, good God, what is this? Well, what it was an attempt to stop him screaming, because those screams were sending everybody into kind of a panic around there. He stopped. The doctor looked down and said, "Well, I can do something here, but we've got to get him to a hospital." So he patched him up as best he could. They did bring in an ambulance and put him in there, and the ambulance then went off down the Sinai Desert to a base probably 20 miles away. Well, everybody in our bunker, after all that was screaming and all the rest, was just like this. And so the cook We all ate out of doors in a great big table. The cook said, "I'm going to make blintzes, so just calm everybody down." The Egyptians, I don't think they could have seen this, but maybe they sensed there was going to be this kind of a gathering. So we had sat down and had just bitten into the first, and there was boom! A mortar had landed just outside the bunker. If it had been 20 feet closer to the mortar itself, it probably would have killed us all. It's just amazing. They had good sharpshooters, but thank God they didn't have very good mortar shooters. And well, then everybody, of course, then went down into the bunkers and all the places we had to hide. And then a firefight ensued back and forth. They would drop more mortar shells onto us there. The Israeli artillery finally began firing back because they wanted the shells to land close on the other side. They were going over us probably at about 20 feet, and you could hear them. You couldn't see them, but you could. Every time a shell went by, you could hear the damn thing. Keep going, don't stop here. I left the bunker 2 days later, went back to Tel Aviv to interview Golda Meir, who was Prime Minister of Israel, for this story. I walked into her office. You know, she was from Milwaukee, born in Milwaukee, near where I grew up. She's sitting there smoking, chain smoking. And I sat down, and she had this gravelly voice, and she said, "Mr. Stolley, I think you'll be pleased to know that Trooper Weinstein not only is going to live, but he will keep his arm." Somebody told her what I'd been through out there at the front, and she was canny enough to start the conversation with me with that piece of information. I thought, I've seen politicians in my life, but this is the great genius. Absolutely amazing.
So Dick, you returned to the States in late 1970.
Yes.
And following your international coverage, signed up for the Overseas Press Club, which is always good to hear. And then you come back to a country that's undergone seismic change that you referred to earlier, but you're also dealing with a magazine that's in the last stage.
Yes.
Can you tell me what that was like personally and professionally? Because you had your whole career at that point.
I did. And
American magazine.
I came back in late 70, and 2 years later, Life died as a weekly. And the editorial staff wasn't kept apprised of the financial difficulty. We could see that the ads, the television had taken away so many of our ads, and other big magazines, Collier's, Saturday Evening Post, had disappeared. But I guess we thought Life was invincible. That turned out not to be the case. For financial reasons, they didn't see any way of ever recovering the kind of advertising that they had lost. As it turned out, I was in charge of the final issue of Life. Life did 2 special issues at the end of each year, and one of them was the year in pictures, and so I was in charge of that, and it was very strange because everybody wanted to help put out that last issue of Life. I've never had so much assistance in my life. Anyway, it was a good issue. I did something that I didn't tell the real managing editor of Life. On the cover was the year in pictures, 1972, and instead of photographs, it was words of newsmakers, places that made news, events, and all the rest, and all these words like this. And I told the art director, who was a good friend of mine, I said, I want down in the right-hand corner, I want you to rearrange those words. I want to put in the word goodbye down there, and I don't want anybody to know it. It was a very sad time, very, very sad time. A lot of people went off and did other things. I remember one woman on the staff went to medical school. One reporter became a photographer. A few of us went into a department called magazine development, and we began working on new magazine ideas. Money magazine came out of that. But the chairman of the board of Time Inc., Andrew High School, came down one day and said, I think you guys ought to look into a magazine based on the people section of Time, which we knew was the most read page in Time. Nobody paid much attention to him, so he finally came down and raised his voice, and then we paid attention. And we put out a test issue, and I was not the editor of it, somebody else was, but I did some work on it. It had Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, paparazzi picture on the cover, typewriter type inside. It flew off the newsstands. We tested it in 13 cities. We tested it with television promotion and without. Tested at 50 cents and at 35 cents. In those cities where it was 35 cents and we had television promotion, it sold out. 90% sale. Nobody had ever seen this thing before. And boy, the response to that was, we better get serious about this. So they asked me if I wanted to be editor of this thing called People magazine, and it worked. I knew if this magazine was going to work, it was going to have to deal with very difficult, sensitive subjects, and therefore the magazine itself should look as clean and simple as possible. So I cleaned it up entirely. I got rid of the typewriter type, very kind of conventional, straightforward design, much different cover. Cover was color, everything else was black and white. We launched in February 1974. It was an immediate newsstand success. We couldn't sell ads for a while, but once they saw how well it was doing in terms of sales, the ads came in, and it turned into both a journalistic and financial success.
I mean, by any account, it's one of the most successful, if not the most successful magazine in publishing history.
The one thing that I always want to say is, when we started this magazine, I said, this is not a celebrity magazine. This is personality journalism. Personality, not celebrity. Personality journalism. And we will be doing stories all over the world, which we did and still do, and it will be on all people in all walks of life. Some will be well known, some will not. Our motto was extraordinary people doing ordinary things and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And the formula worked then and still does.
Do you read it? Do you pick it up every now and then just to...
I keep track of the editors ever since. I read it carefully.
That's great. So why don't we just wrap up here with a few thoughts, a couple of things. First, your long association with the Overseas Press Club. You joined as a member in the early 70s. You were
Well, as soon as I came back, I spent 3 years working overseas, and I became aware of the Overseas Press Club when I was over there, and so when I came back, because people, other Time Life correspondents and correspondents from Newsweek and others, a lot of them were members, and I found out about it. First thing when I came back was to join the OPC. I think records will show in late 1970 I became a member, and I've been a very loyal, served as president for 2 years, and it's very important, and all I can say is, particularly now when a lot of overseas coverage is being cut back for financial reasons, it is absolutely essential that the OPC be out there putting on programs, recruiting new members, showing the importance not only of overseas coverage, but of this organization to keep us all together.
What happens if, in an environment where there is diminished overseas coverage, if there is less of priority on who suffers and how?
Well, the American people suffer, frankly. I mean, what we've done, there's less coverage, but we're depending more on national native correspondence. I mean, the world is all over the world. There are good journalists being trained, and so it isn't so important that we send an American into Israel or into Afghanistan, because we can find good journalists over there with the right kind of coverage and protection and all the rest. We can get the news. What we've got to do is convince American newspapers, magazines, television, all that, to use that coverage to tell the American people what is happening over there, and to tell it in a straightforward, non-sensational, informational way, so they can make credible judgments about what American policy ought to be.
Excellent. Finally, any advice to young journalists as they're getting ready to take a look at working in international journalism here through the OPC? Well,
I think anybody who talks to me, I would think they'd stop me and say, okay, I've heard enough. I'm going to go run off and be a journalist now. I mean, I've had such fun, such a fascinating, to me, interesting life, just day after day, year after year, decade after decade. I can't imagine I didn't consider. I mean, thank God at the age of 12 I knew what I wanted to do, and I'm still doing it. And if I can impart that flame, that kind of dedication, that sense of importance in what you're doing, that sense of adventure, of exhilaration, if I were an accountant, I'd shoot myself. I mean, it's the idea of getting out every day and finding out something new, discovering something new, and meeting interesting people, getting threatened, getting praised. It's a life of exhilaration